You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your educational journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Transparency is one of the foundational principles of agility, providing the conditions for trust, informed decisions, and rapid adaptation. Without open, timely visibility into work, risks, and learning, teams and stakeholders are left to operate on assumptions or partial truths. This gap increases the likelihood of surprises, wasted effort, and reactive firefighting. Transparency does not mean publishing everything indiscriminately. It means deliberately sharing the signals that matter most in formats and cadences that people can use. For example, showing a working increment at a demo provides far more meaningful transparency than a polished slide deck of progress claims. On the exam, transparency scenarios often test whether candidates can differentiate between real signals and theater. The agile response usually emphasizes embedding transparency into the daily flow of work, not bolting it on as a reporting layer. Transparency is valuable only when it shortens the distance between reality and action. Information radiator principles embody this mindset by favoring visible, current, and self-serve signals over ad hoc reporting. Rather than requiring status meetings or custom updates, radiators make information accessible on demand. Kanban boards, dashboards, and automated telemetry streams allow anyone to see the state of work at any time. These artifacts reduce latency between reality and decision-making. For example, if a dependency is blocked, it should be visible on the board immediately, not discovered days later in a meeting. Radiators also create accountability. Because information is always visible, teams maintain discipline in updating it. On the exam, information radiator scenarios often test whether candidates recognize their purpose as reducing delay and distortion. The agile response usually emphasizes transparency that is automatic and reliable. Radiators turn visibility into a habit of the system rather than an occasional reporting exercise. Status visibility must focus on what is valuable, not on busy work or activity volume. Traditional reports often emphasize effort expended, hours logged, tasks completed, but these measures rarely reflect whether outcomes are being achieved. Agile transparency shifts the focus toward current objectives, progress toward outcomes, and flow indicators such as throughput or cycle time. For example, a dashboard that shows lead time stability and alignment with key objectives is far more meaningful than one tracking hours spent. By emphasizing value signals, teams and stakeholders gain clarity on whether they are moving closer to desired results. On the exam, status scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between activity and outcome metrics. The agile response usually emphasizes focusing on signals that reveal value and reliability. Transparency should answer the question, are we delivering what matters? Risk transparency ensures that uncertainties, assumptions, and leading indicators are surfaced early. Many failures are not caused by risks being unforeseeable, but by them being hidden until they become crises. By making risks visible, teams can apply proportionate mitigations before exposure grows. For instance, if a dependency on a vendor API is at risk of delay, surfacing it early allows resequencing or alternative design, rather than discovering the issue at integration time. Risk transparency also creates psychological safety. Teams know they will not be blamed for raising concerns. On the exam, risk transparency scenarios often test whether candidates understand the importance of visibility before certainty. The agile response usually emphasizes early surfacing of unknowns. Risks lose much of their power when they are visible, trackable, and discussed openly. Learning transparency complements status and risk by making insights accessible across the organization. Publishing hypotheses, experiment designs, and results allows other teams to reuse insights, avoid repeating mistakes, and challenge conclusions constructively. For example, if one team discovers that a feature fails to improve engagement, publishing the result prevents others from pursuing the same failed path. Experiment registers or shared wikis institutionalize this learning. Without transparency, valuable knowledge remains trapped in silos or vanishes in memory. On the exam, learning transparency scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between data secrecy and shared insight. The agile response usually emphasizes open publication of learning in usable formats. Learning transparency builds collective intelligence, turning local discoveries into organizational advantage. Audience-aware communication ensures that transparency is meaningful to different groups without fragmenting the source of truth. Teams, leadership, and external stakeholders all need visibility, but the level of detail and cadence may differ. For example, a team may use detailed Kanban boards daily, while leadership reviews high-level dashboards weekly. The key is to maintain one consistent source of truth, with views tailored to each audience. Without this discipline, parallel reporting systems emerge, creating confusion. On the exam, audience awareness scenarios often test whether candidates understand how to adapt communication without distorting information. The agile response usually emphasizes tailoring presentation, not data. Transparency succeeds when each audience gets the clarity they need while staying anchored to the same reality. Consistent definitions prevent transparency from becoming misleading. Terms like blocked, ready, or done must mean the same thing across teams. Without shared definitions, dashboards may appear aligned while hiding divergence. For example, if one team defines done as tested locally, while another requires deployed to production, system-level metrics become unreliable. Establishing shared definitions ensures comparability and trust. On the exam, definition scenarios often test whether candidates recognize the need for alignment on vocabulary. The agile response usually emphasizes defining and revisiting terms explicitly. Transparency fails when words mean different things to different people. Shared language ensures that what appears visible is actually comparable and interpretable across boundaries. Timeliness and freshness standards sustain the reliability of transparency. Information loses value when it is stale. Teams must define how often dashboards, boards, or risk logs are updated, and who owns the updates. For example, work in progress limits lose credibility if boards are not refreshed daily. Freshness standards build trust. Stakeholders know that what they see reflects current reality. Without this discipline, radiators become ignored wallpaper. On the exam, freshness scenarios often test whether candidates can link transparency to timeliness. The agile response usually emphasizes that information must remain current to be actionable. Transparency is only as useful as its ability to shorten the gap between reality and awareness, and freshness is what keeps that gap small. Data quality practices guard against manipulation, drift, or accidental distortion of signals. Automated collection reduces human error, while traceability ensures metrics can be trusted. Spot checks verify that dashboards reflect reality. For example, comparing automated defect counts to audit samples confirms accuracy. Without such practices, transparency risks devolving into green dashboards that hide underlying churn. On the exam, data quality scenarios often test whether candidates understand the difference between visibility and trustworthiness. The agile response usually emphasizes that transparency requires integrity of data. Signals must be reliable, not decorative. Good data practices sustain confidence in transparency and ensure that decisions rest on solid evidence. Privacy and confidentiality guardrails protect sensitive information while maintaining transparency. Not all data can or should be exposed fully. For example, user feedback dashboards may anonymize sensitive details, while competitive strategy may require restricted access. Transparency must coexist with responsibility, ensuring that openness does not compromise security, ethics, or trust. On the exam, privacy scenarios often test whether candidates can balance openness with confidentiality. The agile response usually emphasizes selective redaction rather than secrecy. Transparency is meaningful when it respects ethical and legal boundaries while still providing sufficient clarity for action. Balancing access and protection ensures that transparency builds trust rather than creating new risks. Narrative context complements metrics with explanations in plain language. Numbers reveal trends but can be misinterpreted without story. For example, a spike in defects may be due to deliberate stress testing rather than declining quality. Providing narrative context prevents misreads and reduces panic. Narratives also help stakeholders understand why decisions are made, building trust in leadership. On the exam, narrative context scenarios often test whether candidates can connect metrics to interpretation. The agile response usually emphasizes pairing quantitative and qualitative transparency. Numbers tell part of the story, but context makes them actionable. Transparency succeeds when data and narrative together provide a coherent picture of reality. Distribution awareness ensures that transparency reflects actual user or system experience rather than hiding pain in averages. Percentiles and ranges reveal variation more effectively than simple means. For example, while average response time may be acceptable, the 95th percentile may show that some users experience long delays. Without distribution awareness, dashboards give a false sense of reliability. On the exam, distribution scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize the importance of variation. The agile response usually emphasizes using ranges and percentiles for a complete view. Transparency should reveal outliers, not hide them, because it is often at the edges that real risks and user pain occur. Decision logs provide accountability and future learning by recording what was decided, why, and what signals were expected. Linking logs to outcomes enables traceability. For example, documenting why a certain vendor was chosen and what success indicators would validate that choice helps future teams understand the rationale. Without logs, decisions are forgotten, repeated, or questioned unnecessarily. On the exam, decision log scenarios often test whether candidates recognize the importance of preserving context. The agile response usually emphasizes lightweight but consistent documentation. Transparency includes not only the state of work but the reasoning behind choices, ensuring accountability and enabling continuous learning. Demo culture provides one of the most tangible forms of transparency. By showcasing working increments and experiment outcomes at a regular cadence, teams make progress visible and invite feedback. Demos shift attention from plans and promises to evidence and reality. For example, showing a partially functioning feature allows stakeholders to shape its direction early. Without demos, transparency risks being reduced to abstract numbers. On the exam, demo scenarios often test whether candidates can identify working software as the strongest signal of progress. The agile response usually emphasizes regular, open demos that highlight both product and learning outcomes. Demos make transparency concrete, turning delivery into a shared experience rather than a hidden process. Anti-transparency smells highlight when visibility is cosmetic rather than real. Green dashboards masking churn, slideware in place of working software, or private site agreements that bypass shared agreements all signal dysfunction. These smells erode trust and undermine decisions. For example, if status is always reported as on track until a last-minute crisis emerges, transparency is failing. On the exam, anti-pattern scenarios often test whether candidates can recognize when transparency has degraded into theater. The agile response usually emphasizes vigilance and correction. Transparency is not a performance. It is a practice. Detecting and addressing smells quickly sustains credibility and keeps collaboration rooted in truth. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Minimal vital signals form the backbone of effective transparency. Instead of overwhelming stakeholders with dozens of metrics, teams should focus on a handful that reliably answer the question, are we creating value, and are we doing so predictably? These signals usually span outcomes, flow, and quality. For example, outcome metrics might include customer adoption or satisfaction, Flow metrics might include lead time stability, and quality measures might track defect escapes. If these are visible on a single page, anyone can quickly gauge system health without sifting through noise. On the exam, minimal signal scenarios often test whether candidates can prioritize clarity over volume. The agile response usually emphasizes that less is more. Transparency succeeds when information is concise and relevant, empowering faster and more confident decisions. Work visualization practices bring transparency into daily operations. Boards that display work items, policies, and service classes make flow tangible. Explicit indicators, such as aging markers on cards, reveal bottlenecks. For instance, if several items sit idle in the In Review column, it signals a constraint that must be addressed. Visualization prevents hidden cues and clarifies priorities, reducing misalignment. Without visible flow, problems accumulate invisibly until deadlines loom. On the exam, visualization scenarios often test whether candidates understand the role of boards in surfacing reality. The agile response usually emphasizes practices that make work observable and interpretable. Good visualization is not about decoration, it is about clarity that drives action. Transparency turns invisible churn into visible signals that teams and stakeholders can address together. Risk radars and assumption trackers extend transparency beyond current work into the future. Risk radars display categories of uncertainty, such as technical, market, or compliance risks, while assumption trackers document what must be true for plans to succeed. Leading indicators, such as rising error rates or delayed user feedback, are monitored to trigger timely responses. For example, if an assumption about user availability proves false, the plan can pivot early. Without such visibility, teams are blindsided when risks materialize. On the exam, risk radar scenarios often test whether candidates recognize the value of making uncertainties explicit. The agile response usually emphasizes proactive monitoring. Transparency is not just about what is happening now. It is about keeping risks visible so they can be managed responsibly before they become crises. Experiment registers institutionalize learning by cataloging hypotheses, test designs, cohorts, and results in a structured artifact. This prevents experiments from being forgotten or repeated unnecessarily. For instance, if one team tested a new login flow and found it reduced completion rates, recording the result ensures others do not waste time rediscovering the same lesson. Registers also make assumptions explicit and outcomes reusable. Without them, learning remains fragmented and siloed. On the exam, experiment register scenarios often test whether candidates can connect transparency to organizational learning. The agile response usually emphasizes treating learning as a first-class artifact, not as scattered notes. Registers transform local insights into shared knowledge, scaling learning across teams and reducing duplication of failure. Release and readiness views integrate transparency across workstreams to inform go/no-go decisions. These views combine feature status, quality gates, and operability checks into a system-level perspective. For example, a readiness dashboard may show which features are complete, which tests are passing, and whether monitoring is configured. This evidence-based view reduces reliance on optimism or subjective assurance. Without it, releases become risky leaps of faith. On the exam, readiness scenarios often test whether candidates understand how to replace subjective confidence with objective signals. The agile response usually emphasizes that transparency must extend to delivery checkpoints. Integrated release views make progress and risk visible, ensuring that decisions rest on evidence rather than assumptions. Cross-team transparency aligns groups working on interconnected products or services. Shared roadmaps, dependency boards, and integration calendars prevent surprises when priorities shift or resources are needed. For example, if one team advances a feature requiring data migration, others depending on that system must know early. Without alignment, integration failures and delays multiply. Cross-team artifacts reduce this friction by providing common visibility into plans and constraints. On the exam, cross-team scenarios often test whether candidates can connect alignment practices to flow. The agile response usually emphasizes collective transparency across boundaries. Collaboration strengthens when all teams share the same picture of reality, making coordination proactive rather than reactive. Automation of telemetry and reporting strengthens transparency by reducing reliance on manual updates. Automated pipelines collect metrics on cycle time, defect rates, or build stability, feeding dashboards that update in near real time. For example, every deployment may automatically update defect escape rates, providing fresh insight without extra effort. Automation prevents drift caused by neglected updates and frees humans to focus on analysis. Without it, dashboards risk being stale or misleading. On the exam, automation scenarios often test whether candidates can link automation to data quality. The agile response usually emphasizes consistent, automated signals. Automation sustains transparency under rapid change, ensuring data remains trustworthy while reducing overhead. Accessibility and inclusivity ensure that transparency is available to all stakeholders, not just those with local access. Artifacts must be readable, searchable, and usable across geographies and roles. For instance, a board available only on a physical wall excludes remote members, undermining inclusivity. Providing digital, searchable tools resolves this. Without accessibility, transparency risks becoming gatekept, reinforcing silos. On the exam, accessibility scenarios often test whether candidates understand the need for open tools. The agile response usually emphasizes equity and visibility. Transparency succeeds when everyone has the same opportunity to access and interpret information, regardless of location or role. Inclusivity strengthens alignment by making participation universal. Compliance-friendly transparency integrates audit evidence into daily tools and practices. Approvals, traceability, and test results are captured as part of normal flow, ensuring readiness without last-minute document hunts. For example, when definition of done includes automated traceability logs, compliance requirements are met incrementally. This approach avoids the stop-and-start pattern of pausing delivery for audits. On the exam, compliance scenarios often test whether candidates can reconcile agility with regulatory rigor. The agile response usually emphasizes embedding evidence into normal work. Transparency is most effective when it satisfies both agility and accountability, ensuring that compliance is achieved through visible, everyday practices rather than bolted-on documentation phases. Feedback loops make transparency interactive rather than one-way. Publishing signals is not enough. Teams must invite scrutiny and questions. For example, dashboards should have channels for clarifying anomalies or suggesting improvements. Treating challenges as quality control rather than threats strengthens trust. Without feedback loops, transparency can become decorative rather than useful. On the exam, feedback loop scenarios often test whether candidates can link transparency to continuous improvement. The agile response usually emphasizes two-way engagement. Transparency gains value when it sparks inquiry and learning, not when it simply displays data passively. Healthy transparency encourages challenge because challenge ensures accuracy and actionability. Improvement triggers connect signals to specific actions. For example, if defect rates exceed a defined threshold, a policy may require additional testing or a pause in new feature work. Triggers prevent dashboards from becoming wallpaper by linking metrics to behavior. Without triggers, transparency risks being observed but not acted upon. On the exam, trigger scenarios often test whether candidates can distinguish between decorative and operational metrics. The agile response usually emphasizes actionable thresholds. Transparency matters only if it drives proportionate response. By tying signals to clear actions, teams ensure that transparency is not only informative but operationally significant. Change narratives provide transparency into the why behind scope shifts or reprioritizations. They explain decisions in outcome terms, preserving trust when plans adjust. For instance, if a feature is deprioritized, a narrative might show how it frees resources for a higher value item tied to customer outcomes. Without explanation, stakeholders perceive chaos or neglect. On the exam, change scenarios often test whether candidates can link communication to trust. The agile response usually emphasizes contextual storytelling. Transparency is not only about what is happening, but why it is happening. Narratives prevent erosion of credibility when plans evolve, framing change as evidence-based adaptation rather than arbitrary motion. Sustainment practices keep transparency useful by assigning ownership, rotating review responsibilities, and pruning outdated signals. For example, dashboards that no longer guide decisions should be retired, while ownership ensures that active signals remain current. Without sustainment, information radiators become cluttered or stale, eroding trust. On the exam, sustainment scenarios often test whether candidates understand the importance of lifecycle management. The agile response usually emphasizes curation and accountability. Transparency requires ongoing care to remain meaningful. Pruning, refreshing, and ownership ensure signals stay relevant, supporting clarity rather than creating noise. Verification rituals assess whether transparency is achieving its intended impact. Teams review whether visibility improved decision quality, reduced surprises, or strengthened alignment. For example, if risks remain undiscovered until late stages, transparency practices must be adjusted. Verification prevents transparency from becoming symbolic rather than functional. On the exam, verification scenarios often test whether candidates can evaluate the effectiveness of practices. The agile response usually emphasizes reflection and adjustment. Transparency is a means, not an end, and must be tested for effectiveness like any other agile practice. Regular validation ensures that transparency continues to deliver real value rather than drifting into empty ritual. In conclusion, transparency is the connective tissue of agility, linking reality to trust, learning, and action. Minimal signals, visualized work, and automated telemetry make the present clear. Risk radars, experiment registers, and readiness views expose the future and learning. Inclusivity, compliance integration, and change narratives broaden access and sustain trust. Feedback loops, improvement triggers, and verification rituals ensure transparency remains active and effective. On the exam, candidates will be tested on their ability to identify real transparency versus theater. In practice, organizations thrive when transparency is embedded into everyday flow, making status, risks, and learning visible in ways that drive decisions, sustain trust, and accelerate outcomes. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.